it's a really easy three-step process here. And I would recommend that you watch the commentary I did for TMBS on Tuesday about this. But Venezuela has its own internal problems. Venezuela has its own failings and abuses. It's also been under relentless pressure and economic warfare from the United States going back to the Bush era against Chavez through Obama. And it's escalated today in a profoundly radical way with, by the way, designs from Trump that's not just about Venezuela. This is going to spread to Cuba, Nicaragua. And of course, as in all these cases, if you are so naive and delusional enough to think that there's a humanitarian concern here, look at the governments that they're supporting. Bolsonaro's abuses are going to far exceed Maduro's without any doubt. Even his plans alone for the Amazon and indigenous people are constitute a crime against humanity, not to mention the global planetary system. And there's still democratic functions happening in Venezuela. There's still some of the huge accomplishments of the Bolivarian government still in place. And most Venezuelans, including those who, of course, honestly and fervently oppose this government for absolutely justified reasons, do not want a foreign coup or intervention to install a regime for them. There have been other opposition leaders in Venezuela who have not been able to win elections. And until the 2018 election, where the reporting is mixed, but I would accept that there was some irregularities for sure. Maduro won his first election, according to serious analysts. And there might have been some problems and irregularities, but he won. And it was a much tighter margin. Chavez definitely won his elections. And those that would say otherwise are just sort of, they're telling themselves maybe and you a bedtime story. It's just pure falsehood. So, but leaders like Falcón had a more organic foundation than Guaido. And they did, you could potentially argue in some cases, might have represented a center-left tendency to a contrast with the Bolivarian one. The structures of how you deal with corruption are much more complicated because the corruption networks that have been perpetuated by the Bolivarian government, they have not dealt with it at all, no doubt, predate Chavez. I mean, just like you see in South Africa, the transition to the ANC, the state apparatuses of corruption and patronage networks have just been inherited and perpetuated from under apartheid. These are state structure problems. But that being said, Guaido is a figure of the right. And any person who is going to get propped by the Trump administration, the Colombian government, the Bolsonaro regime, the far-right government of Macri in Argentina, this is not somebody that one can trust or support. And so I still see some people kind of spinning this notion. I don't know where this idea comes from, that he's some type of social democrat. But he's on his way to Brazil. This is a government that holds a former president in prison with no material evidence, and who led all election polls. This President Lula da Silva. This is a government that is attacking viciously the LGBTQ community. This is a government with almost, I would say, massive death plans for the indigenous people in terms of clear-cutting rainforests, and they're attacking labor unions systemically, not to mention all of the very serious and actual material evidence that is emerging between the Bolsonaro family, paramilitaries, and mafias. This is where the social democrat, with the backing of the Trump administration and all of these extremist far-right forces in Latin America, is going to for support. And Brian Mayer of Telesur, who's also editor at Brazil Wire, an indispensable news site on Brazil in particular, obviously, has a report on it. Let's check it out.
São Paulo, where at 10 o'clock tonight, Juan Guaidó is expected to arrive from Colombia on a flight for meetings with Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro to talk about a possible plan of action for renewed aggressions against the democratically elected government of Venezuela. Now, some people are questioning his judgment and even wanting to meet with Bolsonaro because Bolsonaro was unable to establish consensus within his own ruling coalition to support Donald Trump's so-called humanitarian move on Saturday, February 23rd against the government of Venezuela. Apparently, according to Folha do São Paulo newspaper, many of Bolsonaro's top generals, as well as House Speaker Rodrigo Maia, spoke out against any participation in the initiative, and that's why the government only sent 2 pickup trucks with a small amount of supplies on them to partake in this, what appeared to be a publicity stunt that was held on the Brazilian border with Venezuela. So Guaido is arriving. There's going to be a lot of media attention for it, but will there be any concrete results? General Hamilton Mourão, Vice President of Brazil, said the day before yesterday in Colombia that Brazil will not allow the U.S. military to use its territory to launch any kind of military attack against Venezuela, and Brazil will also refuse to engage in these kinds of attacks.
So that's very interesting, and then it runs contrary to all of the moves that the Bolsonaro regime has put in place, which has been recentering the U.S. military command in Brazil, giving way to all U.S. military demands so far, and of course all the demands of Wall Street in terms of things like pension reform and other assaults on Brazilian workers and middle class. But there's a practical reason here. One is political. The Brazilian people, even though they took a far-right turn in this election, are not eager for some type of catastrophic military adventure at Venezuela. And also the Venezuelan military is in much stronger shape than the Brazilian one, and doing this would be extremely dangerous and destructive to both sides. But this is what Guaido is. I mean, look, he's going to seek the support of a fascist government or a fascist aspiring government, and apparently an attempt to instigate even more radical moves that have already been restrained by more sane voices inside that extremist formation of Bolsonaro in Brazil, which, by the way, is already reaching record levels of unpopularity. So that is Guaido. That is this opposition.